15 professional trainers declared the Copper Colt too dangerous to live, their bodies bearing the proof. When Thomas Hayes discovered the horse's stolen name, he understood why the magnificent animal had been fighting for his very soul. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Riverside Equestrian Center, one of the most prestigious horse training facilities in the county. Behind the pristine white fences and manicured lawns, however, a different story was unfolding. In the reinforced paddock at the far end of the property, separated from the other horses by triple-layered fencing, stood a magnificent yet terrifying sight. A young colt, barely 3 years old, with a coat the color of burnished copper and muscles that rippled with power beyond his years. His eyes held a wildness that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who dared meet his gaze. They called him Titan, a name given by the breeding facility that had sold him for an astronomical sum to the center's owner, Marcus Wellington. The colt came from champion bloodlines, with a pedigree that read like royalty. His sire had won countless competitions, and his dam was known for producing offspring with exceptional temperament and trainability. On paper, Titan should have been the star of the facility, the crown jewel that would bring prestige and profit. Instead, he had become their greatest nightmare. The first trainer, a woman named Victoria Chase with 30 years of experience and walls covered in certificates and awards, had lasted exactly 2 weeks. She approached Titan with confidence, certain that her gentle methods and patient demeanor would win him over. But the colt wanted nothing to do with her techniques. Every time she entered his space, he would rear up, his massive hooves slicing through the air like weapons. His screams echoed across the facility, a sound so primal and filled with rage that it made the other horses nervous in their stalls. Victoria left with a sprained wrist and a bruised ego, shaking her head as she packed her equipment. The second trainer was convinced the problem was discipline. Robert Mitchell believed in firm boundaries and establishing dominance from the start. He brought ropes and training sticks, convinced that what Titan needed was to understand who was in charge. His methods lasted 3 days. On the third morning, Titan charged the moment Robert entered the paddock, and it took 4 staff members to help him escape over the fence. The colt stood in the center of his enclosure, snorting and pawing at the ground, victory gleaming in his dark eyes. One by one they came. Trainers with different philosophies, different approaches, different promises. The third trainer tried treats and positive reinforcement, spending hours just sitting in the paddock, waiting for Titan to approach. The colt ignored him completely, as if the man were invisible. The fourth trainer brought in special equipment, a complicated system of leads and pulleys designed to give control while maintaining distance. Titan destroyed it all in less than an hour, reducing expensive gear to twisted metal and shredded leather. By the time the 8th trainer arrived, word had spread through the professional horse training community. Titan was becoming infamous, a cautionary tale whispered about at competitions and conferences. Some trainers refused the job outright when contacted. Others came out of curiosity or pride, certain they would be the one to crack the code. None succeeded. The 9th trainer lasted only a single day. The 10th made it through a week before admitting defeat. The 11th, 12th, and 13th came and went in a blur of failed attempts and frustrated departures. Marcus Wellington watched his investment turn into a liability. The money he had spent on Titan's purchase price alone could have bought 3 quality horses. Add in the fees paid to all these failed trainers, the reinforced fencing, the special accommodations, the liability insurance, and he was hemorrhaging funds with nothing to show for it. His business partners pressured him to cut his losses. Some suggested selling the colt, though who would buy such a dangerous animal was unclear. Others whispered darker solutions, the kind that made Marcus's stomach turn even as he understood their logic. The 14th trainer was a last-ditch effort, a man who specialized in problem horses and came with references from across the country. He studied Titan for days before even attempting to enter the paddock, taking notes and making observations. When he finally made his move, Titan exploded with such fury that the trainer retreated immediately. 2 days later, he told Marcus something that chilled him to the bone. This horse has been broken in some fundamental way. Whatever happened to him before you got him, it damaged something deep inside. I don't think he can be trained. Not by conventional methods, maybe not at all. The 15th trainer arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she came from a facility known for rescuing and rehabilitating abused horses. She had kind eyes and gentle hands, and she spoke to Titan in a voice so soft it was barely audible. For the first time, the colt seemed to listen. He didn't charge, didn't rear, just stood at the far end of the paddock watching her with those intense, unreadable eyes. For 3 days, Sarah worked with him, making microscopic progress. She managed to touch his neck briefly on the 4th day, a moment of connection that gave everyone hope. But on the 5th day, something triggered him. Perhaps a sound, perhaps a movement, perhaps a memory that nobody could see or understand. Titan exploded, and Sarah barely made it out of the paddock. She stood outside the fence afterward, tears streaming down her face, not from fear but from heartbreak. I could see him wanting to trust me, she told Marcus. But something in him is too scared, too hurt. He needs something I can't give him. I'm sorry. After Sarah left, Marcus Wellington sat in his office staring at Titan's papers. 15 trainers, 15 failures. The colt stood in his paddock, alone and untouchable, magnificent and useless, a mystery nobody could solve. The decision came on a cold November morning when frost covered the ground like scattered diamonds. Marcus Wellington had called a meeting with his business partners, 3 men who had invested heavily in the Riverside Equestrian Center and expected returns on their money. They sat around the conference table in the administrative building, their faces grave as Marcus presented the financial reports. The numbers told a story of mounting losses, and at the center of it all was one untamable colt. "We cannot continue like this," said Richard Lawson, the eldest of the partners. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes with the weariness of a man who had seen too many bad investments. 15 professional trainers have failed. We have spent more on this single horse than we make in 6 months from our entire boarding operation. This is not sustainable, Marcus. The second partner, David Chen, leaned forward with his hands folded on the table. His voice was measured but firm. I understand your attachment to this animal. We all do. That bloodline, that potential, it is everything we hoped for when we approved the purchase. But potential means nothing if it cannot be realized. Titan is dangerous. He has injured people. The liability alone could destroy this entire facility if something worse happens. The third partner, James Morrison, had been quiet until now. He was the youngest of the group, but also the most pragmatic. What are our options? Can we sell him? Someone must want a horse with that pedigree, even with behavioral issues. Marcus shook his head slowly. I have made inquiries. Discreetly, of course. But word has spread through the community. Everyone knows about Titan now. The few buyers who showed interest withdrew their offers after learning the details. No reputable facility wants to take on that level of risk. The room fell silent for a moment. Through the window, they could see Titan in his distant paddock, a splash of copper color against the gray autumn landscape. Even from this distance, there was something commanding about his presence, something that drew the eye and held it. Then what do you propose? Richard asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Marcus took a deep breath. There is a livestock auction in 3 days, in the neighboring county. Not the kind we usually deal with. It is mostly farmers and small operations, people looking for workhorses or breeding stock. If we send him there, we can recoup at least part of our investment. You mean dump him, David said quietly. Send him somewhere he will become someone else's problem. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus felt the weight of them, the truth they contained. Yes, he finally admitted. That is exactly what I mean. I see no other option. We cannot keep him. We cannot train him. We cannot sell him through proper channels. At least at the auction, he might find a buyer who has different expectations. Someone who needs a horse for breeding purposes only, perhaps. Someone who can handle him differently than we have. James leaned back in his chair. And if no one buys him at auction? Marcus did not answer immediately. They all knew what happened to horses that did not sell at those kinds of auctions. The buyers who circled at the end, looking for cheap meat, the trucks that took them away. It was an ugly truth that everyone in the horse business knew, but rarely spoke about directly. We will set a reserve price, Marcus finally said. Something reasonable. He will sell. The partners exchanged glances. Finally, Richard nodded. Do what you think is best. But Marcus, make sure this is done quietly. The last thing we need is negative publicity about how we handled this situation. 2 days later, on a Thursday morning before dawn, Marcus stood outside Titan's paddock with 2 experienced handlers. They had a heavy-duty trailer waiting, reinforced sides, and multiple safety features. The plan was to load Titan early, before the other horses were fed, to minimize the risk and commotion. Getting him into the trailer proved to be as difficult as everything else involving Titan. The Colt sensed something was different, some change in the routine that put him on high alert. He circled his paddock nervously, snorting and tossing his head. Every time the handlers attempted to approach, he would charge toward them and then veer away at the last moment, a terrifying game that left everyone with racing hearts. It took nearly 2 hours and the assistance of 2 additional staff members before they finally managed to guide Titan up the ramp and into the trailer. The moment the door closed behind him, the trailer shook with the force of his kicks. The metal walls rang like thunder with each impact. Marcus stood there listening to the sound, feeling something twist inside his chest. This magnificent animal reduced to cargo, shipped away because no one could reach him. The driver of the truck climbed into the cab and started the engine. Marcus walked to the window. Take the back roads, he instructed. Less traffic, less stress on him, and drive carefully. The driver nodded, his expression neutral. He had transported difficult horses before. This was just another job to him. As the trailer pulled away, Marcus watched until it disappeared down the long driveway. Several staff members had gathered near the barn, watching in silence. Some looked relieved, others looked troubled. One of the younger stable hands, a girl named Emma, who had always shown special interest in Titan despite never being allowed near him, wiped tears from her eyes. What will happen to him, she asked. Marcus did not have an answer that would comfort her. He will go to auction. Someone will buy him. He will have a new life somewhere else. But what if no one wants him? What if they send him to... Enough, Marcus said more sharply than he intended. We did everything we could. Sometimes that has to be enough. But as he walked back to his office, those words felt hollow. Had they really done everything? Or had they simply approached the problem from the wrong angle, asking the wrong questions, looking for the wrong solutions? The livestock auction was held in a sprawling facility on the outskirts of Miller County, a place where the air smelled of hay, manure, and the nervous sweat of animals uncertain about their futures. It was nothing like the elegant horse shows and prestigious sales that Marcus Wellington usually attended. Here, everything was practical and utilitarian. Concrete floors, metal gates, harsh fluorescent lighting that buzzed overhead. Farmers in worn jeans and muddy boots stood around discussing prices and evaluating stock with the practiced eyes of people who made their living from the land. Titan arrived in the early afternoon, his trailer pulling into the unloading area alongside trucks carrying cattle, goats, and other horses. The moment the trailer door opened, the handlers knew they had a problem. The Colt exploded out with such force that he nearly knocked down the man holding the lead rope. His eyes rolled white with fear and rage, and his screams echoed across the entire facility. Other animals nearby shifted nervously, sensing the chaos that Titan brought with him. It took 4 men to move him into one of the holding pens, a reinforced stall designed for difficult animals. Even then, Titan threw himself against the walls with such violence that people stopped what they were doing to watch. Some shook their heads and moved on. Others lingered, drawn by the raw power and beauty of the animal, despite his obvious aggression. A few made comments to each other, speculation about what had made such a magnificent horse so dangerous. In the distance, leaning against a fence post and watching the commotion with quiet interest, stood a man named Thomas Hayes. He was 53 years old with weathered skin that spoke of decades spent working outdoors and hands that were calloused and scarred from a lifetime of hard labor. Thomas owned a small farm about 40 miles away, a modest property that had been in his family for 3 generations. He raised a few cattle, grew some crops, and did odd jobs around the county to make ends meet. Life had never been easy for Thomas, but he had learned long ago that the most valuable things rarely were. He had come to the auction hoping to find a workhorse, something strong and steady that could help him with the heavy labor on his farm. His old mare, Bessie, had died 2 months ago, at the age of 28, and Thomas felt her absence every single day. The work was harder without her. More than that, the farm felt emptier. Thomas had never married, had no children, and Bessie had been more than just a work animal. She had been his companion, his friend, someone who understood his silences and shared his solitude. Thomas watched as Titan settled slightly in the holding pen, though his ears remained pinned back and his body stayed tense and coiled like a spring ready to release. There was something about the Colt that caught his attention, something beyond the obvious aggression and fear. In those dark eyes, Thomas saw a reflection of something he recognized: pain, confusion, a deep wound that had nothing to do with physical injury. The auction began at 3 o'clock, with the auctioneer standing on a raised platform overlooking the ring, where animals were brought out one by one. The crowd consisted mostly of farmers and ranchers, people who understood livestock and knew what they were looking for. The bidding was practical and straightforward, none of the ceremony and drama of high-end horse sales. These were working people making working decisions. Titan was scheduled to go through the ring late in the afternoon. By then, Thomas had seen dozens of horses come and go, most selling for reasonable prices to buyers who knew exactly what they were getting. When the handlers finally brought Titan into the ring, the atmosphere changed immediately. The Colt fought every step of the way, rearing and plunging against the leads held by 2 strong men who struggled to control him. His copper coat gleamed under the lights, muscles rippling beneath the surface. He was undeniably beautiful, but he was also undeniably dangerous. The auctioneer began his spiel, describing Titan's bloodline, his age, his potential, but his enthusiasm waned as he watched the Colt's behavior. "Folks, we have here a 3-year-old Colt with championship bloodlines on both sides. This animal has the genetics to produce quality offspring. He needs an experienced handler, someone who can work with his spirited nature." "Spirited," someone in the crowd muttered. "That is one way to put it." The bidding started slow. A few people threw out lowball offers, testing the waters. But as Titan continued to fight in the ring, throwing his head and nearly pulling one of the handlers off his feet, the interest faded. The numbers climbed slowly, reluctantly. Thomas watched the faces around him, seeing the calculations happening behind their eyes. Cost versus risk, potential versus reality. One by one, the bidders dropped out. When the price stalled at barely a quarter of what Marcus Wellington had hoped for, the auctioneer tried to generate more enthusiasm. "Come on, folks. Look at this animal. That bone structure. That muscle tone. Someone here can see what this horse could be, but what he could be and what he was stood in stark contrast. Titan's behavior spoke louder than any pedigree papers. Another potential buyer shook his head and walked away. The auctioneer's voice took on a desperate edge, the tone of someone trying to make a sale that was rapidly falling apart. Thomas found himself raising his hand. The number he called out was modest, well within his limited budget, but still more than he had planned to spend. Heads turned to look at him. The auctioneer seized on the bid immediately, his voice rising with renewed hope. "We have a bid. Do I hear more?" Silence filled the arena. People looked at Thomas like he had lost his mind. A woman standing near him leaned over and whispered, "Mister, that horse is going to kill you. You can see it in him." Thomas did not respond. He kept his eyes on Titan, watching as the colt stood trembling with exhaustion and rage in the center of the ring. The auctioneer called for more bids once, twice, 3 times. When none came, his gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through the building. "Sold to bidder number 73. Just like that, Titan belonged to Thomas Hayes. Around him, people muttered and shook their heads. Some looked at him with pity, others with curiosity. One old farmer approached him as the crowd began to disperse. "Son, I have been around horses my entire life. That animal is beyond help. Whatever you paid for him, it was too much." Thomas simply nodded and thanked the man for his concern. He had heard warnings like this before, though never about a horse. Life had taught him that sometimes the things most broken are the ones most worth saving. Getting Titan into Thomas's old horse trailer was an ordeal that drew a crowd of onlookers. The auction handlers, eager to be done with the dangerous colt, worked with Thomas to guide the animal from the holding pen to the loading area. Titan resisted every step, planting his hooves and refusing to move forward. When force was applied, he would explode into motion, charging and wheeling, scattering everyone within reach. The process took over an hour, and by the end, everyone involved was exhausted and covered in sweat despite the cool November air. Finally, through a combination of patience and strategic positioning, they managed to get Titan up the ramp and into the trailer. The moment the door closed, the kicking started. The entire trailer rocked with the force of it, metal booming like thunder. Thomas winced at each impact, imagining the damage the colt might be doing to himself in his panic. He climbed into the cab of his old pickup truck and started the engine, saying a silent prayer that both horse and trailer would survive the journey home. The drive back to his farm seemed to take forever. Thomas drove slowly, carefully, taking every turn with caution and avoiding rough patches in the road. Behind him, the trailer continued to shake periodically as Titan threw himself against the walls. Other drivers gave him wide berth, clearly able to hear the commotion even over the sound of their own engines. Thomas kept checking his rearview mirror, watching the trailer, hoping the colt would eventually tire himself out and settle. By the time Thomas pulled into his farm driveway, dusk was settling over the land. The property was modest, a simple farmhouse that had seen better days, a barn that leaned slightly to one side but remained structurally sound, and several fenced pastures that rolled gently across the landscape. It was not much, but it was home. Thomas had been born in that farmhouse, had learned to walk in those fields, had buried his parents in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the property. He parked the trailer near the barn and sat in the truck for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Inside the trailer, Titan had finally grown quiet, though Thomas could hear the occasional stomp of a hoof. The farmer took a deep breath and climbed out of the cab. The evening air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of grass and earth. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Thomas approached the trailer slowly and opened the small window at the front to peer inside. Titan stood in the confined space, his coat dark with sweat, his sides heaving. The colt's eyes found Thomas through the opening, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. "What are we going to do with you, boy?" Thomas said softly. The question of how to unload Titan safely was one Thomas had been pondering during the entire drive home. His farm was not equipped like the fancy training facility Titan had come from. He had no reinforced paddocks, no specialized equipment, no team of handlers. It was just him, his land, and a horse that 15 professional trainers could not handle. Thomas decided to use the largest pasture, the one that had been Bessie's favorite. It was about 2 acres, well fenced with strong posts and good wire, far enough from the barn and house that Titan would not pose an immediate danger to the structures. He opened the gate wide and positioned the trailer so that when he opened the back door, Titan would have a direct path into the pasture. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas unlatched the trailer door and swung it open, then quickly moved aside. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Titan appeared at the opening, silhouetted against the fading light. The Colt paused at the top of the ramp, his head high, nostrils flaring as he took in the sense of this new place. Then he exploded down the ramp and into the pasture, running as if his life depended on it. Thomas watched as the copper-colored form raced across the grass, circling the entire perimeter of the fence line at full gallop. There was something wild and magnificent about watching him run, completely unburdened by saddle or halter or human expectation. This was the horse as nature intended, powerful and free and answerable to no one. Titan ran until full darkness fell, his form becoming harder to see against the black landscape. Finally, exhausted, he slowed to a stop in the far corner of the pasture, as far from Thomas and the barn as he could get. Thomas could just barely make out his shape in the darkness, a shadow against shadows. That first night, Thomas did not try to approach. He simply sat on the fence rail, keeping watch from a distance. The temperature dropped as midnight approached, and Thomas pulled his jacket tighter around himself. He thought about going inside to sleep in his warm bed, but something kept him there. Perhaps it was the memory of Bessie, who had always been wary of strangers until she learned to trust. Perhaps it was something deeper, an instinct that told him this horse needed to know he was not alone. Around 2 in the morning, Thomas noticed Titan had moved. The Colt was no longer in the far corner, but had come closer, maybe halfway across the pasture. He stood there in the darkness, a barely visible shape, and Thomas had the distinct impression that the horse was watching him just as he was watching the horse. "Good boy," Thomas said quietly into the night. "Take your time. Nobody is going to hurt you here." The words seemed inadequate, but they were all he had to offer. As the night deepened and the cold intensified, Thomas finally climbed down from the fence and walked slowly toward his house. He turned back once and saw that Titan had not moved, still standing in that same spot, still watching. The farmer raised his hand in a small wave, then continued on his way. Inside the farmhouse, Thomas made himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking out the window toward the pasture where Titan waited in the darkness. He thought about the warnings he had received, about the 15 trainers who had failed, about the obvious danger this animal represented. Then he thought about the look in Titan's eyes, that mixture of fear and pain and something else that Thomas could not quite name. Everyone had tried to train this horse. Maybe what he needed was not training. Maybe what he needed was understanding. The first week with Titan taught Thomas more about patience than 53 years of life had managed to. Each morning, he would wake before dawn and make his way to the pasture fence with a thermos of coffee and a bucket of grain. He would not enter the field, would not attempt to approach. He would simply sit on the fence rail and exist in the same space as the Colt, separated by distance but sharing the same air, the same sunrise, the same quiet moments before the world fully woke. Titan, for his part, maintained his distance. He would stand in the far corner of the pasture, his body tense and alert, watching Thomas with those dark, suspicious eyes. Sometimes the colt would pace along the back fence line, never taking his attention off the man who sat so still and patient at the other end. It was like a dance, Thomas thought, where neither partner was quite ready to move closer, but neither was willing to leave the floor. On the third morning, Thomas began to talk. Not loudly, not with any expectation of being understood, just a low, steady stream of words that filled the silence. He talked about the weather, about the work that needed to be done around the farm, about his parents and the stories they used to tell. He talked about Bessie, about how she had been afraid too at first, how it had taken months before she would let him touch her freely. He talked about loneliness and loss, and the strange ways that life brings certain souls together. Titan's ears would flick toward the sound of Thomas's voice, tracking the words even as his body remained coiled and ready to flee. It was a small response, barely noticeable, but Thomas noticed. He had spent too many years observing animals not to recognize the subtle signs of curiosity breaking through fear. By the end of the first week, Titan had moved closer. Not dramatically, not in any way that seemed intentional, but the colt was no longer pressed against the far fence. He had claimed the middle ground of the pasture as his territory, and from there he would watch Thomas go about his daily routines. The farmer made sure to establish patterns, to be predictable and consistent. Same time every morning for the coffee and the talking. Same time every evening to bring hay and fresh water. Same slow, deliberate movements, same calm energy. Thomas's neighbors thought he had lost his mind. Word had spread about the dangerous horse from the auction, and people would drive past his farm slowly, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the infamous Titan. Old friends stopped by with concerns thinly disguised as social visits. "Thomas," they would say, "this is not safe. You are alone out here. If something happens, if that horse decides to attack, nobody will even know until it is too late." Thomas would listen politely and thank them for their concern, but he never wavered. There was something between him and this horse, something he could not explain even to himself. It was not about taming or training or breaking. It was about connection, about two damaged souls recognizing something in each other that the rest of the world could not see. The second week brought a breakthrough so small that anyone else might have missed it. Thomas was sitting on his usual spot on the fence, sipping his morning coffee and talking about nothing in particular, when Titan took a step toward him. Just one step, tentative and uncertain, but a step nonetheless in Thomas's direction rather than away. The farmer kept talking as if nothing had changed, giving no indication that he had noticed this monumental shift. Inside, his heart was racing, but outwardly he remained calm and steady. The next morning, Titan took 2 steps. The morning after that, 3. It became a pattern, this gradual closing of distance. Each day, the colt would venture a little closer, testing the waters of trust. And each day, Thomas would sit exactly where he always sat, doing exactly what he always did, providing the stability and predictability that Titan so desperately needed. On a cold morning near the end of the second week, Thomas arrived at the fence to find Titan already waiting. The colt was not in his usual spot in the middle of the pasture. He was standing perhaps 20 feet from where Thomas would sit, and there was something different in his posture. The tension was still there. The wariness had not disappeared, but there was also something new. Anticipation, perhaps, or maybe hope. Thomas went through his morning routine, setting down his thermos and bucket, climbing up onto the fence rail, settling into position. He poured his coffee, took a sip, and began to talk. And as he talked, Titan walked closer. Step by step, slowly and carefully, the colt crossed those 20 feet until he stood just out of arm's reach. For a long moment, neither moved. Man and horse regarded each other in the pale morning light, separated by mere feet, but connected by something that ran far deeper than physical proximity. Thomas could see every detail of Titan's face now, the flecks of lighter color in his dark eyes, the way his nostrils flared with each breath, the faint scars on his muzzle that spoke of past traumas. "Hello there," Thomas said softly. "I have been waiting to meet you properly." Titan's ears swiveled forward, focused entirely on Thomas. The Colt took one more step, then another, until he was close enough that Thomas could have reached out and touched him. But Thomas did not move. This was Titan's choice to make, Titan's boundary to cross. All Thomas could do was wait and hope and believe that this broken, beautiful creature would take that final leap of faith. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Titan lowered his head. It was a gesture of submission, of trust, of acceptance. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes, unexpected and unbidden. He blinked them away and smiled, his weathered face crinkling with genuine joy. "That is it, boy. That is it. You are safe now. I promise you, you are safe." The sun continued its climb over the horizon, painting the farm in shades of gold and amber. In that pasture, under that vast sky, a bridge had been built between two souls who had both known too much loneliness. The breakthrough with Titan opened doors that Thomas had not dared to imagine. Over the following days, the Colt began to allow physical contact, tentative at first, just a brief touch on his neck before he would shy away. But each touch lasted a little longer, and soon Thomas could run his hand along Titan's shoulder, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the copper coat, the warmth of life pulsing just under the surface. Thomas discovered something during these quiet sessions that the trainers before him had never understood. Titan was not aggressive by nature. He was terrified. Every violent outburst, every attack, every moment of rage had been driven by pure fear. Somewhere in his short life, something had happened to this horse, something that had taught him that humans brought pain and betrayal. The aggression was armor, a desperate attempt to protect himself from being hurt again. So Thomas took a different approach. He did not try to control Titan. He did not demand obedience or submission. Instead, he simply offered companionship. He would sit with the Colt for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in peaceful silence. He brought apples and carrots, not as rewards for good behavior, but as gifts freely given. He moved slowly and predictably, telegraphing every action so that Titan always knew what to expect. The neighbors continued to watch from a distance, their skepticism gradually transforming into curiosity. Martha Henderson, who owned the adjacent property, would sometimes stand at her fence line in the evenings, watching Thomas work with Titan. One evening, she called out to him as he was leaving the pasture, "Thomas, I have to admit, I did not think you had a chance with that horse, but whatever you are doing, it seems to be working." Thomas smiled and walked over to the fence that separated their properties. "I am not doing much of anything, Martha. Just giving him time and space to figure out that not all people are bad." Martha shook her head in wonder. "In all my years, I have never seen anything like it. That horse was supposed to be impossible. Everyone said so." "People say a lot of things," Thomas replied. "Does not make them true." As the third week turned into the fourth, Titan began to follow Thomas around the pasture, not aggressively, not demandingly, but with the gentle curiosity of a creature beginning to trust. When Thomas would come to replace the water in the trough, Titan would amble over and stand nearby, watching the process with interest. When Thomas sat on the fence rail for their morning talks, Titan would position himself close enough to hear every word clearly. One afternoon, as Thomas was checking the fence posts along the perimeter, he felt something touch his shoulder. He turned slowly to find Titan standing right behind him, the Colt's soft muzzle pressed against his shirt. The horse was initiating contact, seeking connection rather than merely tolerating it. Thomas reached up carefully and scratched behind Titan's ears, a gesture the Colt leaned into with obvious pleasure. "Good boy," Thomas murmured. "You are turning into quite the friend, are you not?" The transformation was remarkable, but it was not complete. There were still moments when something would trigger Titan's fear, when the old panic would flash in his eyes and his body would tense for flight or fight. A sudden loud noise from the road, a bird taking off unexpectedly from the grass, the sound of a vehicle backfiring in the distance. In those moments, Thomas had learned to simply stop moving and start talking, his calm voice serving as an anchor to pull Titan back from the edge of terror. It was during one of these episodes that Thomas finally understood what had been done to this horse. A truck had driven past on the county road, its engine making a particular rattling sound. Titan had exploded into panic, racing around the pasture with that same wild fear that had characterized his early days. But this time, instead of maintaining distance, the colt ran straight to Thomas, pressing against him as if seeking protection. As Thomas held the trembling horse, speaking softly and stroking his neck, he felt scars under his fingers. They were faint, easily missed, but they were there. Long, thin lines across Titan's shoulders and flanks. Whip marks. Someone had beaten this horse, had used pain and violence in an attempt to control him. The realization filled Thomas with a rage he rarely felt, but he pushed it down. Anger would not help Titan now. Only patience and love could heal those invisible wounds. That evening, Thomas did something he had not done since his mother passed away 15 years earlier. He prayed. Not in a church or with any formal words, just a simple conversation with whatever power might be listening. He thanked the universe for bringing Titan to him, and he asked for the wisdom to help this damaged creature find peace. The answer came not in words, but in understanding. Thomas realized that he and Titan were mirrors of each other. The horse had been abandoned and betrayed, labeled as dangerous and worthless by those who should have cared for him. Thomas, in his own way, had been abandoned too. By his parents through death, by potential partners who could not see past his humble circumstances, by a society that often overlooked men like him who worked with their hands and lived simple lives. They were both survivors, both carrying scars that others could not see. And perhaps that was why they had found each other. Perhaps that was why Thomas had raised his hand at the auction when everyone else had walked away. Not luck or chance, but recognition. One wounded soul seeing another and refusing to let them face the darkness alone. By the end of the first month, Titan would greet Thomas at the gate each morning, nickering softly in welcome. The copper coat that had been dull with stress and poor care now gleamed with health. The eyes that had been filled with rage and fear now showed contentment and trust. The body that had been coiled with constant tension now moved with easy grace through the pasture. Thomas began to work with Titan on basic handling, not with any goal of riding or working him, but simply to ensure the colt could be safely managed for veterinary care or any other necessary interactions. He introduced a halter slowly, letting Titan investigate it thoroughly before ever attempting to put it on. The first time the halter went over Titan's ears, the colt stood perfectly still, trusting Thomas completely. Winter arrived in earnest during the second month, bringing with it cold winds and occasional snow that blanketed the farm in white silence. Thomas made sure Titan had access to the shelter in the barn, but the colt often chose to remain outside, his thick winter coat protecting him from the elements. There was something about Titan that seemed to crave the openness of the sky, the freedom of space around him. Thomas understood this and never forced him inside, even on the coldest nights. The daily routines continued regardless of weather. Every morning, Thomas would trudge through snow or mud or frost to bring Titan his grain and fresh hay. The colt would meet him at the gate, sometimes with his muzzle dusted with snow, always with that soft nicker of greeting that had become Thomas's favorite sound in the world. They would stand together while Titan ate, the farmer's hand resting on the horse's neck, both drawing comfort from the simple presence of the other. It was during one of these cold December mornings that Thomas noticed something unusual. Titan was standing at the gate as always, but his attention was focused beyond the farm, toward the county road in the distance. His ears were pricked forward with intense interest, and his body language suggested alertness rather than fear. Thomas followed his gaze and saw what had captured the Colt's attention. A horse trailer was passing on the road, likely heading to one of the other farms in the area. Thomas watched Titan carefully, ready to intervene if the sight of the trailer triggered bad memories. But instead of panic, he saw something different in the Colt's expression. Curiosity, perhaps even longing. It made Thomas wonder if, despite everything that had happened, Titan still remembered the other horses he had known, still felt some pull toward his own kind. The incident stayed with Thomas throughout the day. He had been so focused on healing Titan's relationship with humans that he had not considered the Colt's need for equine companionship. Titan had spent the past 2 months alone except for Thomas. For a herd animal, that isolation might be taking its own toll, even if the Colt was too traumatized to show it clearly. That evening, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea and his old ledger, looking at his finances with a critical eye. Money had always been tight, and buying Titan had stretched his budget considerably. But as he looked at the numbers, calculating and recalculating, he thought maybe, just maybe, there might be room for one more mouth to feed. Not another horse from an auction or a fancy breeding facility. Something simpler. Something that would not compete with Titan but could provide him with companionship. 3 days later, Thomas drove his truck to a small farm about 20 miles away, where an elderly woman named Grace Sullivan was downsizing her small petting zoo operation. Among her animals was a miniature donkey named Pepper, a gentle creature with a gray coat and soulful eyes who had been at the farm for nearly a decade. Grace was looking for good homes for her animals, places where they would be loved and cared for properly. When Thomas explained his situation, described Titan and his traumatic past and his current isolation, Grace smiled warmly. A donkey might be exactly what your horse needs. They are calming creatures, donkeys. They do not demand much, but they give a lot. And Pepper here, she has always had a gift for making friends with troubled souls. Thomas paid Grace a modest sum, far less than she could have asked, because she could see in his weathered face and calloused hands that this was a man who would treasure any animal lucky enough to land in his care. They loaded Pepper into a small section of the horse trailer, and the little donkey made the journey to Thomas's farm with remarkable calm, as if she understood something good was about to happen. Introducing Pepper to Titan required the same patience Thomas had used in everything else involving the Colt. He set up a temporary pen in the barn where Pepper could stay safely while the two animals got used to each other's presence through a fence. The first time Titan saw the donkey, he approached with cautious curiosity, stretching his neck over the fence to sniff this strange new creature who had appeared in his territory. Pepper, for her part, seemed completely unfazed by the large horse looming over her. She lifted her soft muzzle to meet Titan's, and they touched noses in that ancient greeting that animals share. Then Pepper simply went back to eating her hay, as if to say that Titan was interesting, but not particularly threatening. Over the next several days, Thomas supervised their interactions carefully. He would lead Titan to the fence where Pepper stayed, letting them spend time together with the barrier between them. Gradually, Titan's body language relaxed around the donkey. The tension that still sometimes appeared around Thomas, a lingering shadow of trauma, seemed to evaporate completely in Pepper's presence. After a week of fence-line meetings, Thomas decided it was time to let them share space. He opened the gate between Pepper's pen and Titan's pasture on a mild afternoon when the sun was shining and the air felt more like early spring than late December. Pepper walked out into the larger pasture with her characteristic unhurried gait, and Titan followed at a respectful distance. For the first hour, they simply existed in the same space, Pepper grazing contentedly, while Titan circled around her in wider and wider arcs. Then something shifted. Titan approached the donkey directly and lowered his head, pressing his forehead gently against Pepper's shoulder. The little donkey leaned into the touch, and they stood like that for a long moment, two animals offering each other comfort and companionship. Thomas watched from the fence, his eyes misting over despite the cold. It was such a simple thing, this connection between two animals, but it represented something profound. Titan was learning to trust again, not just humans, but other creatures as well. He was rebuilding the social bonds that trauma had shattered. That night, when Thomas did his evening check, he found Titan and Pepper standing together near the water trough, the large horse's body curved protectively around the smaller donkey's form. They looked peaceful, content, like they had been companions for years rather than days. "Good night, friends," Thomas called softly from the gate. "Sleep well." As he walked back to the house, Thomas felt a fullness in his chest that he had not experienced in years. His little farm, once so quiet and empty after Bessie's passing, now felt alive again with purpose and connection. The transformation of Titan became the talk of the county. Word spread through the network of farmers and horse people, traveling from coffee shops to feed stores to Sunday church gatherings. The dangerous colt that 15 trainers could not handle, the one that had terrorized the prestigious Riverside Equestrian Center, was now peacefully living on a humble farm with a poor farmer and a miniature donkey. Some people simply did not believe it. Others were intrigued enough to want to see for themselves. Martha Henderson was the first to ask if she could visit. She arrived on a Saturday morning with fresh baked bread and genuine curiosity. Thomas led her to the pasture fence where Titan and Pepper were grazing side by side in the weak winter sunlight. The colt, seeing Martha, raised his head briefly, assessed her as no threat, and returned to his grazing. It was such a normal, calm response that Martha actually laughed. "I would not have believed it if I had not seen it with my own eyes," she said, shaking her head. "That is truly the same horse from the auction?" "The one everyone said was going to kill you. Same horse, different life," Thomas replied simply. "But what did you do? What is your secret? People are going to want to know." Thomas thought about that for a moment, watching Titan move peacefully across the pasture with Pepper trailing behind him like a small gray shadow. "I did not do anything special, Martha. I just gave him time and space to be himself, let him know he was safe. That is all any creature really needs." More visitors came in the following weeks. Some were neighbors, others were horse trainers and owners from farther away who had heard the story and wanted to witness the miracle for themselves. Thomas welcomed them politely, but kept the visits brief. Too much attention made him uncomfortable, and more importantly, he wanted to protect Titan from being turned into some kind of spectacle. The colt had suffered enough from human expectations and demands. One cold February afternoon, a Mercedes sedan pulled up the long driveway to the farm. Thomas was in the barn repairing a stall door when he heard the expensive purr of the engine. He walked outside, wiping his hands on his jeans to find a well-dressed man climbing out of the driver's seat. Even from a distance, Thomas recognized the bearing of wealth, the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what they wanted. The man introduced himself as Marcus Wellington, and the name struck a chord in Thomas's memory. This was the owner of Riverside Equestrian Center, the man who had sent Titan to auction. Marcus looked around the humble farm with barely concealed disdain, his eyes taking in the leaning barn, the patched fences, the modest farmhouse that had weathered too many storms. "I came to see the horse," Marcus said without preamble. "I heard rumors that you somehow managed to gentle him. I had to see if it was true." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest, a protective instinct that rose immediately. "Titan is doing fine. He is happy here. May I see him?" Thomas hesitated, but there was no legitimate reason to refuse. He led Marcus to the pasture where Titan and Pepper stood together near the barn. At the sight of Marcus, something changed in Titan. The Colt's head shot up, his nostrils flared, and his entire body went rigid. He did not charge or attack, but the tension that had been absent for weeks suddenly flooded back into his frame. "Easy, boy," Thomas called out calmly. "You are all right." Marcus stared at Titan with a complex expression that mixed regret, anger, and something that might have been shame. "That is definitely him. I spent a fortune on that horse, brought in the best trainers money could buy. Nothing worked. He was completely unmanageable." "Maybe you were trying to manage the wrong thing," Thomas said quietly. Marcus turned to look at him. "What is that supposed to mean? You tried to control him, train him, break him down and rebuild him the way you wanted. But he did not need any of that. He just needed someone to accept him as he was." The wealthy man's face flushed. "I invested significant resources in that animal. I gave him every advantage. The finest facilities, the best care, expert trainers. Everything except kindness," Thomas replied. "Everything except patience, everything except the understanding that maybe he had already been broken before you got him, and what he needed was healing, not training." Marcus Wellington looked at Thomas with something between offense and curiosity. "You think you're better than all those professionals? You with your rundown farm and no credentials?" Thomas shook his head. "I do not think I am better than anyone, but I do think that sometimes the simplest approach is the right one." Titan did not need expensive equipment or complicated techniques. He needed time, space, and someone who would not give up on him. "I want to buy him back," Marcus said suddenly. "Name your price. Whatever you paid at auction, I will triple it." The offer hung in the air between them. Thomas looked at Titan, who was still watching Marcus with wary eyes, his body pressed close to Pepper's reassuring presence. Then he looked back at the wealthy man standing in his yard, trying to buy his way back into something he had thrown away. "He is not for sale," Thomas said firmly. "Be reasonable. I can offer you more money than you will see in 5 years of farming. 10 years. You could renovate this entire property with what I am willing to pay. Money does not enter into this. Titan stays here. This is his home now." Marcus Wellington's expression hardened. "You do not understand what you are dealing with. That horse comes from champion bloodlines. He is worth a fortune if properly developed. You are wasting his potential keeping him here as a pet. His potential," Thomas said slowly, "is to be happy and safe, and he is both of those things right now. So no, Mr. Wellington, you cannot buy him, not for triple the price. Not for 10 times the price. Some things are not for sale." The two men stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Marcus pulled a business card from his wallet and held it out. "When you change your mind, call me. The offer stands." Thomas did not take the card. "I will not be changing my mind." Marcus Wellington climbed back into his Mercedes and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that slowly settled over the farm. Thomas stood there watching until the car disappeared, then walked to the pasture fence where Titan had finally relaxed, the tension draining from his body now that the threat had departed. "You are not going anywhere, boy," Thomas said softly. "This is your home for as long as you want it to be." Titan walked closer to the fence, close enough that Thomas could reach through, and rest his hand on the colt's neck. They stood like that for a long time, man and horse, connected by something far more valuable than money. Spring arrived slowly that year, creeping across the land in subtle increments. The snow melted gradually, revealing the brown grass underneath that would soon turn green again. The days grew longer, the sun warmer, and the farm began to wake from its winter sleep. Thomas felt it in his bones, that ancient rhythm of seasons turning, of life renewing itself after the dormant months. But something else was stirring in Thomas's body, something less welcome. He had been ignoring the signs for weeks, dismissing them as simple fatigue from the hard work of maintaining the farm alone. The shortness of breath when he climbed the hill to check the back fence, the tightness in his chest that came and went without warning, the exhaustion that seemed disproportionate to the actual physical effort he was expending. Thomas was a man who had spent his entire life being strong and self-reliant. Admitting weakness felt foreign, almost shameful. So he pushed through, telling himself it was just age catching up with him, just the normal wear and tear of 53 years of physical labor. He would rest more, take things a bit slower, and everything would be fine. Titan noticed before any human did. Animals have instincts that humans have long since lost, an ability to sense changes in those they care about that operates below the level of conscious thought. The Colt began staying closer to Thomas during their time together, following him more attentively around the pasture. When Thomas would pause to catch his breath leaning against a fence post, Titan would come and stand beside him, pressing his warm body against the farmer's side as if trying to lend him strength. One morning in early March, Thomas woke feeling worse than usual. The tightness in his chest had become a genuine pain, a squeezing sensation that made it difficult to take deep breaths. He sat on the edge of his bed for several minutes, willing the feeling to pass, but it only intensified. For the first time, real fear crept into his heart. This was not just fatigue or age. This was something serious. He managed to dress and make his way outside for the morning feeding, moving slowly and deliberately. Titan was waiting at the gate as always, but his greeting was different. The Colt did not nicker or press forward for attention. Instead, he stood very still, watching Thomas with an intensity that was almost unsettling. When Thomas opened the gate and stepped into the pasture, Titan came immediately to his side and stayed there, matching his pace as they walked toward the water trough. Thomas tried to maintain his normal routine, but his body was betraying him. The simple act of filling water buckets left him winded and dizzy. He had to stop 3 times just to cross the pasture, leaning heavily against Titan each time. The Colt stood like a statue during these pauses, providing a solid support that Thomas desperately needed. "I am all right, boy," Thomas murmured, though they both knew it was not true. "Just need to catch my breath." After the feeding was done, Thomas intended to head back to the house, but his legs gave out before he could reach the gate. He sank to his knees in the grass, one hand pressed against his chest, the other reaching out to steady himself. The world tilted and swayed around him, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he might lose consciousness right there in the pasture. Titan moved immediately. The Colt positioned himself beside Thomas and carefully, gently, lowered himself to the ground. It was an unusual posture for a horse, one that left them vulnerable, but Titan seemed to understand that Thomas needed him at this level. The farmer leaned against the Colt's warm side, drawing comfort from the steady rise and fall of Titan's breathing. They stayed like that for nearly an hour. Thomas knew he should try to get to the house, should call someone for help, but he could not seem to find the strength to move. His mind drifted, touching on memories of his parents, of Bessie, of all the years he had spent on this land. He thought about Titan and the journey they had taken together, from that first terrifying day at the auction to this moment of quiet companionship. Eventually, the acute pain subsided enough that Thomas felt he could move. With Titan's help, quite literally using the Colt to pull himself upright, he managed to stand. The walk back to the house took forever, but Titan stayed right beside him the entire way, moving at Thomas's painfully slow pace. When they reached the gate, the Colt stopped and watched as Thomas made his way across the yard. Inside the house, Thomas collapsed into his chair and sat there for a long time, trying to gather his thoughts. He knew he needed to see a doctor, knew that whatever was happening was beyond his ability to ignore or overcome through sheer willpower. But the thought of leaving the farm, of leaving Titan, filled him with an anxiety that was almost as intense as the chest pain. That afternoon, Martha Henderson drove by and noticed that Thomas had not been out working in his usual spots. Something about the unusual quiet of the farm concerned her, so she pulled into the driveway and knocked on the door. When Thomas answered, looking pale and shaken, she immediately took charge. Within an hour, she had Thomas in her car and was driving him to the county hospital, despite his weak protests. The diagnosis came quickly. Thomas's heart was failing, damaged by years of untreated high blood pressure and the natural weakening that comes with age and hard living. The doctor, a young woman with kind eyes and a serious demeanor, explained that he needed rest, medication, and significant lifestyle changes. No more heavy physical labor. No more pushing through pain and exhaustion. He needed care, monitoring, and time to heal if healing was even possible at this stage. Thomas listened to all of this with a sinking feeling in his stomach. The implications were clear. He could not maintain the farm alone anymore. He could barely take care of himself, let alone the animals that depended on him. The doctor wanted to admit him for observation, to run more tests, and adjust his medications, but Thomas refused. He had to get home. He had to make sure Titan was all right. Martha drove him back to the farm in worried silence. When they pulled into the driveway, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pastures. Thomas could see Titan standing at the gate, his copper form silhouetted against the darkening sky. The Colt had been waiting there, watching for his return. Thomas climbed out of the car with effort, every movement feeling like it required twice the energy it should. Martha offered to help with the evening feeding, and he accepted gratefully. Together they managed to get hay and water to Titan and Pepper, though Thomas had to stop and rest multiple times. When the work was done, and Martha had left with promises to check on him tomorrow, Thomas walked slowly to the pasture fence. Titan came immediately, pressing his head against Thomas's chest in that gesture of affection that had become so familiar. The farmer wrapped his arms around the colt's neck, feeling tears prick at his eyes for the first time since his mother's funeral. "I do not know what is going to happen, boy," he whispered into Titan's mane. "But I promise you this. Whatever comes, I will make sure you are taken care of. You will never go back to that life. Never." Titan stood perfectly still, accepting the embrace, offering his silent strength to the man who had given him a second chance at life. The following weeks were difficult for Thomas. His body demanded rest that his spirit resisted giving. The medications helped, but they also made him foggy and tired. Simple tasks that he used to complete without thought now required careful planning and frequent breaks. Martha and several other neighbors formed an informal rotation, stopping by to help with chores and make sure Thomas was following doctor's orders. But the hardest part was not being able to spend time with Titan the way he used to. Their morning talks at the fence had to be shortened. The long walks around the pasture were impossible now. Thomas would sit on his porch and watch Titan and Pepper in the distance, feeling the separation like a physical ache. The Colt seemed to sense the change. He would stand at the fence for hours, looking toward the house, waiting for Thomas to come out. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the hospital visit, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her late 30s pulled up in a modest pickup truck and introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen. The name stirred a memory, and Thomas suddenly realized this was the 15th trainer, the last one who had tried to work with Titan at Riverside Equestrian Center. "I heard you were the one who bought Titan from the auction," Sarah said, her voice gentle but curious. "I also heard that he is doing well here. I had to come see for myself. I have thought about that horse every day since I left him." Thomas invited her to walk to the pasture, moving at his new, slower pace. When they reached the fence, Titan was grazing with Pepper nearby. At the sound of voices, the Colt raised his head and approached. Sarah caught her breath when she saw him. The transformation was remarkable. This was still the same horse she had worked with months ago, but everything about him was different. The tension was gone. The wild fear in his eyes had been replaced with calm contentment. His body moved with relaxed grace instead of coiled aggression. "How did you do it?" Sarah asked, wonder evident in her voice. "Sarah, what was your secret?" Thomas smiled slightly. "No secret. I just called him by his true name." Sarah looked confused. "His true name? You mean Titan?" Thomas shook his head. Titan was the name given to him by people who saw only what they wanted him to be. Strong, powerful, dominant, a champion. But that was never who he really was. All that aggression, all that fear, it was not his nature. It was armor he built to protect himself from a world that had hurt him. "So what is his true name?" Sarah asked softly. Thomas reached through the fence to stroke Titan's neck. The Colt leaned into his touch, closing his eyes with contentment. "His true name is the one that describes who he really is, not what people wanted him to be. He is gentle. He is kind. He is loyal and loving and desperately in need of someone to understand him." The trainers all failed because they kept calling him Titan and trying to make him live up to that name. I succeeded because I looked past the name and saw the soul underneath. Sarah stood in silence for a long moment, watching Thomas and Titan together. Tears gathered in her eyes. I knew there was something special in him. I could feel it, but I did not know how to reach it. "You tried," Thomas said gently. "That matters. You saw him as more than just a problem to be solved. That is why you cried when you left. I heard about that." Sarah wiped her eyes and managed to smile. "I'm glad he found you. Truly. But I have to ask, what happens now? I heard you have been ill. What will become of him if you cannot care for him anymore?" The question that had been haunting Thomas for weeks hung in the air between them. Before he could answer, Sarah spoke again. "I run a rescue facility now, a place for horses that have been traumatized or abused. We specialize in rehabilitation and finding them appropriate homes. If you ever need help, if circumstances change, I want you to know that Titan would have a place there, not as a project or a challenge, but as a valued resident. I would personally oversee his care." Thomas felt a weight lift slightly from his chest. Knowing there was a backup plan, someone who understood Titan and would protect him, brought comfort he had not expected. "I appreciate that more than you know. But for now, as long as I have breath in my body, Titan stays here. This is his home." Over the following months, Thomas slowly adapted to his new limitations. He could not do the heavy work anymore, but he could still sit on the fence and talk to Titan every morning. He could still bring carrots and apples. He could still be present, and that seemed to be enough. Titan did not need him to be strong or capable of hard labor. The Colt just needed him to be there, to offer that steady, unchanging love that had transformed both their lives. The story of Thomas and Titan spread beyond the county, becoming something of a legend. People would drive from far away just to see the once dangerous Colt living peacefully with a humble farmer and a miniature donkey. Thomas welcomed visitors occasionally, but he always kept them brief. Titan was not a spectacle. He was family. On a warm evening in late summer, Thomas sat on his porch watching the sun set over the pastures. Titan and Pepper grazed side by side in the golden light, their shadows stretching long across the grass. The scene was so peaceful, so perfect, that Thomas felt his eyes fill with tears. Not tears of sadness, but of gratitude for this unexpected gift that had come into his life when he needed it most. He thought about all the trainers who had tried and failed to reach Titan, thought about Marcus Wellington and his expensive facilities and expert methods, thought about the fear and aggression that had made everyone believe this horse was beyond saving, and he thought about that day at the auction when something had compelled him to raise his hand, to take a chance on a creature that everyone else had given up on. The truth was simple, Thomas realized. You could not train or control or dominate a soul into healing. You could only love it, accept it, and give it the space to discover its own true nature. That was what he had done for Titan. And in return, Titan had done the same for him, showing Thomas that his life still had purpose, that his capacity for love had not diminished with age or solitude. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the sky, Thomas called out across the pasture one final time. "Good night, boy. Sleep well." Titan raised his head, looked toward the porch where Thomas sat, and gave a soft nicker that carried clearly through the evening air. It was a sound of contentment, of belonging, of love, the sound of a horse who had finally found his true home and his true name, not in any words spoken aloud, but in the understanding that passed between two souls who had saved each other. Thomas smiled and went inside, his heart full despite its weakness, knowing that tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another morning with Titan, another day of this simple, profound connection that had changed everything. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.